Good morning, Morai Rabotai. Bruchim Abayim. We are continuing on Masechet Makkot, and we are at the very end of Perek Rishon, the end of Perek Ketzat Haidim. Today's Amud is being learned L'schut Refuah Shelema of Rachel Simcha Bat Nahid, Yael Bat Loren Esther Shoshana, Iman Yitzchak Ben Eliza. His Amud is also being learned for Refuah Shelema of Binyamin Eliezer HaKohen Ben Malka, and Sarah Bat Mina. His Amud is being learned for the schut of proper shidduch for Gilhad Ben Mordechai Ariel, and a healthy delivery, Be'ezrat Hashem, for Talia Bat Rivka, and for Hatzlacha of Avraham Rafael. As Amud is sponsored this week with Dayan families, Cohen family, and Shea families. Be'ezrat Hashem should be a Hatzlacha for all of them. Amen. We can't really complete the Amud without discussing one of the last pieces of the Mishnah over here that we dash in the Gemara in Masechet Makkot Vav Amud Bet. There the Mishnah says, Al pi shnayim edim. We've been discussing, of course, edim zomemim, and the Mishnah says, Al pi shnayim edim, thank you, that shelo teheh Sanhedrin shomat mipi haturgeman, that a Sanhedrin is not allowed to rely on translation of a turgeman. You can't have a translator in the Bedin. The Dayanim have to hear it directly and understand it by themselves from the Edim. So that's the Mishnah. And the Gemara went through discussions, and the Gemara brought the story from Rava, that Rava had this case that came in front of him from two people, Anashim Lo Azim, foreigners, that they came and he asked for a turgeman, a translator, to stand in the Bedin translating for him. And the Gemara said, no, well, he really understood what they were saying, but he couldn't communicate back. What's important is the Dayan should understand what they are saying by himself, even if he can't relate to them in the same language fluently. As long as he understands it, it's fine. That's the Gemara that we had. Now, the questions that are to be asked is it only for the Edim that the Pasuk is talking about? Because the language of the Mishnah is Al pi shnayim edim, which is directly speaking about the witnesses, not the Baal Edin. So, if I have two people who have an issue with each other, there's no Edim over there. The Baal Edin themselves, the two sides of the Machloket, they speak a different language. Can I have a Turgeman? Is it only a halacha regarding witnesses? Because in witnesses, every detail really matters, what they are testifying. Baal Edin, as long as I get the gist of what the argument is about, I could be a Dayan. Is that the case? Or even by Baal Edin, maybe we have the same halacha. That's one. And secondly, is it only by Dinei Nefashot? Because when the Pasuk speaks about this, Al pi shnayim edim, or Al pi shlosha edim, is talking about only Dinei Nefashot. The Pasuk that the Mishnah brings is Al pi shnayim edim, or shlosha edim, yumat hamet, lo yumat al pi ed echad. When you have Dinei Nefashot, you have this Pasuk of Al pi shnayim edim, that the Dayan has to understand exactly what's going on. So maybe this din is only limited to Dinei Nefashot when you're actually judging a death sentence. Now, why is this important? Of course, you can understand, because nowadays we have kibbutz galuyot. Many people speak languages that you're not familiar with. You can have someone come into the Bedin that speaks only Spanish, only Portuguese, only French, only Farsi, only Arabic. Right? You have a Taimani couple coming to Eretz Yisrael. They'll speak Arabic if they come into the Bedin, so then you have to understand Arabic. Persians, then if you have French Moroccans or any other French people, then they speak French. So with the blessing of having a kibbutz galuyot come together, comes a challenge of even in the United States, really, we've had many cases that they don't speak the language fluently, very broken English, and they need somebody to come with them. So do you have to find a dayan that understands this as his native language, as a fluent French, Arabic, Farsi, whatever it is, speaker, Hebrew for that matter? Many people were Israelis that come here, half a million Israelis in the valley, and if you find a dayan that doesn't speak a fluent thing, understands the Chumash and basic Hebrew, but doesn't have the modern twist of how they quickly speak. So is that something? So I want to read to you a Rambam. A Rambam in the beginning of Hilchot Sanhedrin, in Perek Bet, Rambam writes the qualifications for a dayan. Rambam really speaks about this in two different places, but Rambam in the beginning of Hilchot Sanhedrin, in Perek Bet, writes the following. I'll read to you a little bit. This is basically the whole Perek is speaking about this very beautiful language of Rambam. Kedai to read this as a separate limud, but he says, "En ma'amidin beSanhedrin ben begdola ben bektana." Whether you are dealing with dinei nefashot of Sanhedrin Gedolah of 71 dayanim, or even Sanhedrin Ketana of 23, both of those you need anashim chachamim v'nevonim mufraim b'chokhmat Torah, people that were wise, who are smart. They are well versed in chokhmat Torah. Ba'alei da'at merubeh, they have high level of liquid IQ. V'yodin k'tzat mish'ar chokhmot, and they also know other wisdoms. They know other sciences as well. He mentions chokhmat harifua. You have to know, as a whole machloket, why do you need to have why you need to be a doctor to be a dayan in the Sanhedrin? It's a whole question, because sometimes you have to assess the well-being of the person in question. They need to know math, kufot, mazalot, istagnud. They need to know astronomy, astrology, all of those things. They also need to know black magic, white magic, gray magic, sleight of hand, and all of the things that come with it. He calls it havle avodah zarah, the emptiness of avodah zarah. The reason he calls it this, by the way, just in parentheses, is because Rambam holds that all of these things do not exist. In other words, there's a machloket in the early Geonim and between the Rishonim as well, whether or not when the Torah says lo tenachashun v'lo techashefu, don't do all of these things of kishuf, black magic, and the me'onenim, or v'deoni, all the things that the Torah talks about as supernatural powers. Rambam holds that they don't really exist. There are two ways to look at them. One is they do exist, and the Torah prohibits them, because we, the Jews, are not supposed to follow those powers. But there are powers. There is magic, right? There is actual kishuf. Or maybe the way to look at it is don't follow them because they're bogus and empty and not real. It's just a sleight of hand, and there's no real thing called magic. And there's no real thing called connecting with the dead and asking things and figuring out things and voodoo and all those things, right? Rambam is a very strong believer of the second way, that all these things are bogus. They don't really exist. There's no such a thing as kishuf. All there is sleight of hand, right? A person went through the wall of China, sleight of hand, right? Someone puts a sword in his body and comes from the other side, sleight of hand. All of these things. Now, nowadays, we could relate to that much more because there's a whole industry called magic, unless you have some, haughty, crazy guy that he really thinks that he could bend a spoon with his eyes and so on and so forth, and it becomes a whole lawsuit and he loses, right? Of course, that those who know that this actually happened with one of the Israeli so-called magicians, that he actually insisted that he has powers, and somebody actually debunked him, and then it became a whole lawsuit. But Rambam says, in Mechol Avodah Zarah, Perek Yud Aleph, Halachat Zayin, I think it is, the very end there, he says, En lanu, he said, Bnei Yisrael who are chachamim, mechukamim, they are wise people, smart people. It's not fit for them to believe in this emptiness and bogus nothingness of the goyim. It's all for people of, defected intellect, people who are not smart. They believe in these things, and the kumarim of Avodah Zarah, the priests use the gullible people with these tricks in order to pull them after themselves and make a living.
So how does he account for the sorcerers in Egypt?
Says all of them were sleight of hand. That's what he says. Actually, Malbim writes like that as well. Without getting into too many details of this is a very long-standing machloket that goes all the way back. And then you have the Geonim that talk about this. We talk about Rav Shmuel Bar Chofni Gaon, and the Radak brings this in Sefer Shmuel when Shaul, at the end of his life, is helpless, and he goes to this woman of Ovei Deoni, and pulls down basically the neshama of Shmuel HaNavi and communicates with him. That's where the machloket is. There are those who say this whole thing she was very smart and very slick in what she was doing, and they read it into every pasuk and they answer every question that you could ask. And there are others who disagree. They say, no, this is actually there. You're just not supposed to use it, right? The Vilna Gaon, in Chod Avodah Zarah, in Shulchan Aruch Yored Siman Kuf Ayin Zayin, very vehemently disagrees with the Rambam. So all the respect to Rambam, of course, he knows who the Rambam is and so on, but he says, unfortunately, he was tilted after the philosophers and so on, and he establishes that there are many Gemarot that you cannot learn the Gemara without understanding that there is actual Kishuf and so on. So that stands as a machloket that started already from the time of the Geonim and trickled down all the way to our generation. Of course, our generation, I mean, the CRC, the Vaad of Chicago put out a declaration that is asur to bring magicians to parties and so on and so forth because of these things. It's not only Chacham Obadia that says it is asur, but it is it's well accepted. But they, the Moshe Feinstein and Moshe Sternbach, surprising source, they both write that it's not like a blanket isur that you cannot bring a magician, which seems to be the psak of the CRC and Chacham Obadia and many others. But they say, well, if you make sure that people know that these things are just a sleight of hand, and you have a sign over there, and the magician shows maybe one trick and explains it to people how he did it, then people believe that this is no powers and so on and so forth, then it's fine. Well, the problem with that is when you ask the magician to show one of these tricks, he shows the one that everyone knows is a trick, but then he does things and you're like, gee, what happened exactly there? But that it is what it is. The minhag has evolved, and many people, many organizations, even the Torah organizations, they are lenient to bring magicians and so on. But again, this is a real serious halachic question, but we went through a long tangent to just explain why Rambam calls this Havle Avodah Zarah. It's Havalim, it's empty, it's bogus. But nevertheless, even those emptiness and tricks, the Anshe Sanhedrin have to know all of those things. That when a trickster comes in front of you, you know what's a trick, what's not a trick. You have to be well versed in all of those. Then, I'm skipping a little bit over here, but he writes, the Rambam in Halakha Vav, it's very interesting. He brings all these halachot that you have to have Kohanim, Levim, Yisraelim, right? It has to be, you don't put a very old person, not because they're not sharp, even if they're super sharp, you don't appoint to Sanhedrin someone that is very old. You fire them, basically. They get a retirement, not the early retirement, but a retirement, because an old person is not compassionate enough. When a person gets very old, there's a level of achzariyut that they don't care about. There's to be the din only. That's what Rambam, I'll read to you the language. En ma'amidin be'kol Sanhedrin lo zaken mufrak be'shanim ve'lo saris mipnei sheyesh bahem achzariyut. We want people who are compassionate to be on the bedin, to care about the life and the situation of the person at question. Just give me a second. Velo mi she'en lo banim. And even if they're not that old, if a person doesn't have children, pasul to be a son, because if you don't have children, you don't have compassion. You don't understand what it means to have compassion until you have a family, until you have children. According to some shittas, it has to be small children. It has to be young children that because they are, it could be frustrating, it could be, I see the smiles around the table, it's amazing. That's a level of compassion that is required for being a dayan.
What's really old?
It's a good question. You take a look at the Mefarshei Rambam, what exactly is considered zaken muflag. It's more than 70, 75. So, says Rambam Mihalacha Vav, וצריך להשתדל ולבדוק ולחפש שיהיו כולן בעלי שיבה, בעלי קומה, בעלי מראה. They should also be, they should be old enough, they should be tall and good looking. This is talking about the dayanim, right? מנוקים מכל מומי הגוף, they have no blemish in their body. וצריך להשתדל ולבדוק ולחפש שיהיו כולן, he says Rambam, all these requirements, ושיהיו יודעים ברוב הלשונות. Coming to what we need, Rambam writes, they should know the majority of the languages. Because we don't want the Sanhedrin to be hearing it from the translator. Right? So that's where this Gemara comes into play. But now he changes it, that they should know not all the languages, but the majority of languages. So the Kesef Mishnah Maran asks, he says, why rov leshonot? Mishum de davar zarhu lehimatze mi sheyodea bekol 70 lashon. Very strange to find somebody that actually knows 70 languages, right? Maybe in Sanhedrin there were people like that, but the requirement is the majority of the spoken languages in the country. That's what you want them to know. Umashmal Rabenu the high end moshivin hainu the hecha de mishtakhi aval ilo mishtakhi. This that Rambam very carefully says that you try to find people like this is because if you didn't find, it's not a psul. It's not like the beginning halachot that it actually is a requirement. Here is a requirement. If you could find people like that in the applications, that's what you're going to choose. All the other odds even. Now Rambam writes also, and this is where it comes to our question. Now I'm jumping 20 prakim ahead, right? Rambam, this was in Chol Sanhedrin, Perek Bet, Halacha Bet and Vav, Aleph Bet and Vav. Now we're discussing Rambam in Perek Chaf Aleph of Chol Sanhedrin, Halacha Chet. Lo yihye dayan shomea mipi turgeman. Again he brings this. He says dayan should not hear the arguments from a translator, unless he himself also understands what they're saying. He understands what they're saying for additional help of relaying the messages to them. He is standing there, a turgeman, a translator, and says the Rambam, he hears their arguments, but he can't fluently speak back to say his part to the Baalei Din. For him to explain to them what his psak is and why he paskined the way he paskined, he has a turgeman. But their arguments he hears and understands directly. Where did the Rambam get this from? From Makkot Avav, from our sugya of Zayin, our sugya of Rava, going on based on the Mishnah and Avav Amud Bet. That's where Rambam got this psak from. So what Rambam just did is, Rambam is telling you that he understood the Gemara, that Rava, who had this case in the Gemara, was understanding not the Edim but the Baalei Din. So therefore, Rambam just extended this halacha that even though that the pasuk speaks about the witnesses, Rambam extends it to also the Baalei Din. Not just the witnesses you have to understand their language, but the arguments of the two sides without the witnesses even. You have to understand that also. The din Torah has to be directly understood by the Dayan. It's not just the Radbaz disagrees with that right over here. Radbaz says, no, the case of the Gemara is that Rava was listening not to the Baalei Din but to Edim, because Baalei Din are not included in this argument. It's the Edim, because Edut, the testimony, is very sensitive. You miss one little piece and the testimony is off. Understanding the case, and the argument of the you could understand the basic gist of who he borrowed from him. He borrowed from him. He killed him. He didn't kill him. But once you want to get into the trenches and really start bedikot and chakirot and drishot that the Gemara in Sanhedrin talks about, all the details of what it was, what color it was, what type of hat he was wearing, where did he come from, what direction did you see it, those are detailed things. You have to understand the language to be able, if you miss one detail, you may have missed the testimony. So says the Radbaz, really the Gemara is talking about Edim by the Baalei Din. You don't have to necessarily understand. So that's one thing for the Dayanim nowadays, one leniency. The second leniency is that Radbaz says, even according to the Rambam, even according to the Shita that says, even Baalei Din you have to understand their language, writes the Radbaz that even there, it's only midarabanan. Hainu, midarabanan be'alma, sharei pasuk medaber be'edim. The pasuk, as we explained in the very beginning of the shiur today, says, al pi shnayim edim o shlosha edim. Based on those two, Yumat Hamed is talking about edim. It's clear. So even Rambam, who extends it to the Baalei Din, he's telling you that Midrabbanan is extendable to the Baalei Din. Not that he understands that the same halacha applies to the Baalei Din. It's Midrabbanan. So once it's Midrabbanan, it is more kal, and says the Radbaz, the real Din Torah is talking about when you want to put someone to death. It's a judgment over someone's life and death. When you are adjudicating death penalty, then you have this thing with the oraita. But when you have other things, it will be a preferable thing. So if you have other dayanim, says the rabbis, if you have other dayanim, and this is again the Shulchan Aruch and the Pitchet Tshuva in Siman Yud Zayin of Choshen Mishpat in Halacha Vav, לא יהיה הדיין שומע מפי המתורגמן, ואם היה מכיר בלשונם ושומע טענותיהם, אבל אינו יודע בלשונם כל כך שיודע להשיב להם להודיעם פסק דין, מותר להעמיד מתורגמן. This is the Rambam in Perek Chaf Aleph that the Shulchan Aruch paskins almost verbatim. And the Ramah says, take a look at the earlier Siman, Siman Yud Gimel, אם טוענים בכתב, אם אחד רוצה לטעון בלשון אחר, right? The details of this halacha. Now, Pitchet Tshuva also brings this, that if you have an option of other dayanim, so you take those dayanim, right? Because Rava, that was the case of the Gemara. There were other people, other dayanim that understood that language. And the Gemara's question is, why did Rava not defer to them? But if you don't, says the Radbaz, you could even understand, and this is the Chiddush, right? You could even understand and adjudicate based on sign language, that they're explaining to you that you really don't share a language together. And you could even, short of dinei nefashot. So by dinei nefashot, there's no kula, because that's already the biblical level. When you are talking something that is adjudicating dinei nefashot, you have to understand their language like as a native. But if it's dinei mamonot, if it's other things, even if they could relay their message with sign language and they're not actually speaking the language, that is, as long as they clearly are getting across what they mean, that is also fine. So what's the halacha l'maaseh? Halacha l'maaseh is, if you have dayanim that could understand, in other words, the bedin, the herkev of the bedin could include dayanim that understand that language and culture as their native language, of course you should choose those lechatchila. But b'di'evet, if you don't have that option, For regular dinei bedin nowadays, it would be mutar to use a meturgeman, a translator, and if you don't have a meturgeman, you could try to communicate as long as the line of communication is open in a way that you understand what is being said and what is being argued. Even that would be mutar. Again, this is not a halacha l'mas issue, it's just to explore one little line in the Gemara and one little story in the Gemara, how it develops actually to a fantastic piece of halacha.
I forget what it's called, but in the betting, there's also these lawyers that can come with you.
Right? A to'en.
The to'en. So how does the to'en fit into the fact that?
So to'en is not necessarily translating anything. The to'en, the job of a proper to'en is to be very honest, as someone that deals with these things, the job of a good to'en is to weed out 90% of the things that people say in Bedin, which is irrelevant, is all emotional buff, right? You know, that a lot of this happened, and then he said it. 80-90% of the things that people end up saying in the Bedin is irrelevant, right? And then you have, that argument that is a halachic argument. And many times, because of all the emotions that are involved, those main pieces of argument that should be said are not said. And then 2-3 hours or 2-3 sessions into the Bedin say, that was the case. Why didn't you say it before? Because they didn't think it makes a difference. So when you have somebody that actually understands what is important, what is not important, when they prepare the person, they're supposed to ask him all those proper questions and present their case in a halachic way that it makes the shortest way possible to make all the important points, right? And that makes it so much more easy for the dayanim to get to the bottom of the case properly. So that would be in a lachatchila, in a perfect world, that would be the job of orche din, the to'en dayani that would come to the bedin to help each one of the sides. But of course, the challenge of that could be like lawyers. It becomes, instead of being an orche dayanim, it becomes. Orche dayanim sounds bad because the Mishnah says you should not be like orche dayanim, but it's, instead of being a proper to'en, you become a lawyer trying to cover the things that are bad for him and present it in a way that's maybe not even 100% true, and present a shach or a taz or one shita, present a one-sided picture of finding the right poskim that pass in one way versus the other. So of course that becomes a challenge, and sometimes it becomes harder than easier. But so that therefore some Batei Din do not allow to'anim, because of the cases that they have had. But that's the difference. Okay, B'ezrat Hashem, we'll start the second parak in the days to come. Hazaku Baruch.